Just going to make a few announcements before I get to the main course. I do have something that I recorded in, I think it was late March. Wasn't too impressed by it when I listened to it in the immediate aftermath of recording it. But I also didn't delete it. I stuck it in a spam folder. And then a few days ago I decided to re-listen to it, and I said to myself, well, this is damn good. I should have uploaded this immediately. And, well, better late than never, so I'll be connecting it to this. But first things first, I'm going to make a few announcements. I've got 3 blog posts that I've posted in the intervening time, and I'm going to link those in the low bar. And before you click, I guess I should just give a little bit of a synopsis for all 3 so you know what you're getting into. First one's called 12 Rules for Analytical Life, and I take a few pot shots at Mr. Peterson, but for the most part I keep it above the belt. And I do have these 12 rules that are actually insightful, as I titled them. And so rule number 1 is I basically say why it's good to get a handle on epistemology. Doesn't mean you have to solve epistemology or devote a huge chunk of your time to reading up on its timeline or anything like that, but it's good to just get a handle on it. Rule number 2, I give an example of what it means to get a handle on game theory and decision theory, and I use the arms race 2.0 as it's sometimes called. Arms race 2.0 in terms of international relations and superintelligence, and, well, which government's going to get there first. And even if you are highly risk averse and you don't want your taxpayer dollars going to this stuff in terms of research and development still subsidizing it, it's still either your government's going to get to it first or a potentially hostile foreign government's going to get there first. So unless you think the foreign government that's hostile to your government is actually more benevolent or more competent at handling something like that, you should still not take issue with the fact that some percent of your taxpayer dollars is going to research and development that may be directly or indirectly subsidizing these highly risky ventures. As long as the 2 subsidizers, or more than 2, but let's just simplify it to 2, as long as 2 subsidizers of a potentially lethal thing are not equally bad, then you should back the one that's less bad. Which means that you can never object to, in principle, on risk-averse grounds, the government subsidizing some highly risky thing. Unless all governments are equally crazy, which is not the case. Rule number 3, what the hell was rule number 3? Oh yes, I talk about familial loyalty and how there's never a reason for it in and of itself. It can only be a sort of supplementary reason that maps onto it. But a lot of people guilt trip themselves when they are accused of being disloyal to family members, whether immediate family members or extended relatives. And we see that with the holiday get-together phenomenon, where people always keep doing it even though they keep bitching about it. So I'm just saying, if you keep bitching about it, simply stop doing it. Disassociate yourself. Don't come up with bogus excuses to disassociate yourself. If there's nothing but hidden hostility year after year, then simply do away with it. The only exception being is if the familial relations consist of a young child who gets something out of you that you don't necessarily get from them. But when it comes to some adult that may get something beneficial from you that you now feel obligated to fulfill, no, it's every bit the unwillingness to fulfill that sort of wish from a non-family person in your life is the same as the unwillingness to fulfill such a thing, to play out such a role when it comes to a familial figure, whether immediate or extended. It's apathy. Apathy is the sweet spot. Don't strive for disloyalty in and of itself. Don't strive for loyalty in and of itself. Just start out with apathy. And I single out 2 forms of solidarity that I say are cogent. Cerebral solidarity and characterological solidarity. and then I say all else is noise, whether it's class solidarity, familial solidarity, gendered solidarity, racialized solidarity, all of it is noise. Two things, all else is crap. Rule number 4, I talk about skepticism about moral responsibility and how it's widely under-discussed. Talk about how if there's ever going to be a culture that's worthy of being preserved, it's going to have to be a culture that gives this issue its due in terms of mass coverage. And as things stand right now, even the best cultures don't do that. Issue is woefully under-discussed and neglected. Not all media landscapes are equal, but even the best media landscape you can find is not going to give this issue its due in terms of proper coverage. Any coverage it may get here and there is going to be highly slanted, because people really do believe that moral responsibility is the edifice of moral philosophy. And it's not so. And I'll link to the specific sections in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on skepticism about moral responsibility, where Dirk Parabum, who's a philosopher who's well known for just destroying arguments that say that, well, there has to be a connection between the two. And I link to those sections, and I highly urge people to read up on it. Rule number 5, I talk about population ethics. I don't go into too much detail, but I essentially list reasons as to why person-affecting views are more plausible, which is not to say that the worst position in person-affecting views, which is called presentism, which says that the only ethically relevant persons are persons who exist presently, why that might be better than the best position on the world-affecting views, something like totalism or averagism. I'm simply making the case that the best position within the person-affecting folder, which is actualism, which says that the only persons who matter ethically are persons who necessarily exist now, necessarily have existed in the past, and will necessarily exist in the future, are the ones who matter. And all uniquely realizable or potential persons, that's just noise over signal. And I embed a video by Jordan Peterson where he's crying about the historical neglect of the individual, and I pretty much say, well, you can actually get person-affecting views from that sort of cautionary tale that he's engaged in. It's a pretty famous video that's been making the rounds of him frantic about how we are slowly forgetting the value of the individual. And I pretty much say, well, just substitute the individual for the actual individual who exists presently, and then substitute the group, which he's saying that we should never confuse these things, the value of the individual versus the value of the group. Only the individual suffers, as he keeps saying in that video. And I'm saying, okay, so substitute that with the individual who actually exists, and substitute the group for the potential persons, those poor unborn deers who will be condemned to an eternity of potentiality unless they're brought into the world. And you get that same sort of cautionary tale. So even though he doesn't know anything about population ethics, he has unwittingly made a case, at least if you squint just right. He has made the case for the person-affecting restriction in population ethics, which is hilarious, seeing as how he is gung-ho about that theory of truth, which it's only true if it serves life, right? So he has to believe that an extinction can be bad, even though it can be bad for a single individual. What's bad for the individual is that the individual ceases to exist against his wishes. Right? So it's a self-directed preference for his life that he doesn't get to acquire some sort of immortality. But the move that usually gets made is you go from but by spawning the next generation, we somehow think that that doesn't thwart the individual's preference for immortality as much. But that only works if you turn those self-directed preferences into other directed preferences. So it's no longer person-affecting. It jumbles things. So that's rule number 5. Rule number 6, I link to Thinking Fast and Slow, which I referenced in a few videos last year, and I pretty much talk about how you should disengage from activism, because with activism typically comes blue lies, which is lying for the cause, feel-good propaganda and stuff like that. And I pretty much say that, seeing as how we can't really estimate the individuated contributions, whether from allies, frenemies, or enemies, we can't estimate them in summed outcomes. We can't even have any hope of doing so. And so I'm talking about how, when it comes to the conflict between doing good and thinking good, doing good is always a crapshoot. Whereas thinking good in 2018, like, you're not going to have your best possible candid assessment of something come back and bite you in the ass in 2028. Whereas if you do everything right in 2018 and you have these near-term good effects, those near-term good effects can easily come back and bite you in the ass in 2028. It's not a foregone conclusion that the nearsighted good will map on to the far-sighted good. That's just basic probability theory 101. So I'm pretty much saying that when you're doing activism, when you're engaged in even just political discourse, do it, but do it sparsely. Because you do it too long, you will just get hypnotized by it, and then you will do the blue lies and so on and so forth. And, well, I don't need to reference the just absolute shit show that is the political landscape. Rule 7, I embed a video by Stephen Hicks where he essentially thinks that beliefs are in some way dispositional, and he references master morality, and he references ressentiment, drawing heavily from Nietzsche, and I just absolutely rip all those concepts apart, and I explain how beliefs are in no way dispositional. Rule number 8, I talk about how selfishness is A-okay when you're in the company of ethical egoists or people who converge on those kinds of moral philosophies, NIMBY types. If they would paradoxically want you to do it, then you should do it. And when it comes to rule number 9, I say that, well, you can make up for plenty of that selfishness by singling out the worst off and assisting them. So the selfless to selfish ratio is highly contingent on what type of individuals you find yourself in the company of. And it doesn't even have to be proximate company, seeing as how you can do transfers of money and all of that EA stuff that I talked about in 2016 and a bit in 2017. I just pretty much recap that, and I drive the point home that selfishness around an ethical egoist is, I mean, it's what they would want you to do. They would want you to be as selfish as possible within the confines of the law, and so A-okay. Make things easier on yourself by calibrating when to do the altruistic deed and when to do the egoistic deed. Rule 10, I talk about the 20th century and how it's presented as being this highly historical aberrant in terms of it having spilled far more blood than any century that preceded it. And of course that's down to weaponry enhancement and population booms. When you look at things per capita, it's hard to ignore all the benefits and to say that the harms trump the benefits. Sort of stuff that Steven Pinker has written about at length, and I think I do link to a conversation with Pinker and a few other people on the topic. And of course you can read his new book, Enlightenment Now, that drives those points home as well. It's been making the rounds. And what dovetails into that subject is the idea that it was the decline of faith, the loss of faith in the divine in the 20th century that really made that happen. And that's not me misparaphrasing that. I'll link to videos where people say that outright. it sort of made something of a comeback, that there's a causal link between the loss of faith and the fact that these atrocities happen. And it's essentially saying that had the revolutionary forces of Stalinism, Leninism, Marxism, Maoism, had those come with religious sprinkles on top, there would have been a lot more harm reduction. People wouldn't have been as ideologically possessed as they were, which is insane. All you need to look at is the sectarian beefs and the holy wars of pretty much every century that preceded it. There's always been conflict that stemmed from, heavily stemmed from, religious sectarianism. And even if you just single out one of those, it's enough to undermine the claim that had faith not declined in the 20th century, these revolutions would have been much more humane and much less blood would have been spilled if people thought that they were actually going to have to answer to their deeds in the afterlife, or something to that effect. Clearly didn't prevent fanaticism prior to the 20th century, fanaticism on religious grounds. Why would it have prevented it in the 20th century? Stupid arguments. I go into why at length in the Rule 11. What the hell was Rule 11? Rule 11, I talk about the fallacy of relative privation, which says that, well, people who try to distract you from discussing topic A by pointing out that topic B is worse, they're bad actors, and I'd be all okay with that if they actually distinguished between barely and non-barely better and worse problems. And of course, the fallacy citers never do that. Rule number 12, I talk about logic, and I rag on people who just insert the word logic without any qualifications. Talk about the different 9 types of logic, which often bump heads, and how one is not any more or less logical than the other 8. So, anytime you reference logic, you need to supplement it with the typologic, most well known, for example, Aristotelian logic, and then go from there. But people don't do that. People, I think, seem to have this view that there is a sort of flat logic, and that's never the case. Devil's in the details. And I haven't seen a single logician argue to the contrary, arguing that there's a master logic where one of those 9 trumps the other ones, or like maybe there's a hierarchy of these 9 logics. If a logician has argued anything like that and I've missed it, I would love to be linked to it and to see what an argument of that nature would actually look like, because to me it seems impossible. But I'm no connoisseur of formal logic, so maybe I just haven't dug deep into the field to see such a task undertaken. I analogize it to democracy. It's an easy analogy, but fuck it, I ran with it. Because, of course, the proponent of direct democracy can't accuse the proponent of representative democracy of being less democratic or in some way inconsistent or unprincipled because he believes in representative democracy. Right? There is no flat democracy. So that's as far as that post goes. The second post I'm going to link to, I talk about Nick Bostrom's paper Infinite Ethics, and he comes up with this thing he calls the infinitarian paralysis, applies it to aggregative ethical theories, pretty much theories that believe that value is aggregative, though it applies to other pluralistic theories as well that aggregate up to a point. And to the extent that a theory aggregates more, it will be more plagued by this infinitarian paralysis. And what it is essentially standard cosmology, modern cosmology, teaches that the world might very well contain an infinite number of, let's say, whatever you find to be intrinsically valuable. So let's say suffering and flourishing. So the world may very well contain an infinite number of happy and sad people or happy and sad organisms. And when you look at standard cardinal arithmetic, there's no way to alter the state of an infinite quantity of something by adding or subtracting a finite quantity of that very thing to the infinite quantity, right? So when you accept that, or the likelihood of that, it implies that aggregative ethics say that you can't really do anything ethical or unethical, right? And you might just balk at that because you think that, well, modern cosmologists are full of shit on the issue of there being an infinite source or an infinite supply of something like suffering and flourishing. And I don't want to say I'm agnostic, because I certainly lean to the possibility that the likelihood is that there is an infinite supply of these things, because who am I to be unfazed by the expertise of cosmologists? I will defer to the specialists in the field to the extent that the consensus is, well, it's a consensus. As things change within the field, if things change within the field, so will my views. But my views I will be a conciliationist on that topic. So I definitely do take that seriously. And then I apply a problem of my own to it, which is, so we start with aggregative ethics that say temporal neutrality is the name of the game. So you don't discount interest based on the fact that the person may exist in an incomprehensibly vast future that you can't in any way map your calculations onto, like temporal neutrality. And I take that and I add the element of life as a zero-sum game, and that's when these things become truly bizarre, because it doesn't matter what the welfare level of each individual is. Insofar as you believe that all welfare levels are below neutral or just at neutral, then a world where everyone is just shy of neutral is every bit as interchangeable as a world where everyone is well below neutral or at the peak of negative, whatever the negative quality is, whether it's pure suffering or a thwarting of preferences or what have you. You have to believe that all these things are interchangeable because there's an infinite supply of them. So a permanence of mediocrity is interchangeable with a permanence of just some of the most extreme suffering you can contemplate, insofar as there is an infinity of it, if all that matters is the aggregate at the end. So you can read that post. It's probably the most mind-bending post I've done, but that's what modern cosmology teaches. Don't shoot the messenger. That's modern cosmology, and it would be unwise to simply dismiss it. You don't have to believe that the evidence is conclusive that there may well be an infinite supply of the bad. You just have to believe that, you just have to acknowledge that, well, it's in no way dismissible. The consensus among specialists in the field cannot be hand-waved. In the final post, I'm not going to paraphrase everything because this is going on for way too long, but one of the things I do in my final post is I come up with the concept of the yellow button. So we all know about the red button and we all know about the green button. The red button is just a termination of all life with a simple press, all sentient life, let's say. The green button is like abiogenesis, or maybe whatever turns non-sentient life into sentient life. And so people have, discussed, well, what's worse, pressing the red button, pressing the green button. People may say that the red button is all upside and zero downside, at least in certain circles that may converge on the viewership of this video. So yeah, though that's been how the debate has been framed in the past. First came discussion of the red button, and then along came the green button. So what I do is I introduce the yellow button, which if you press it, you wipe out human life. Or maybe not even wipe out human life, but you incapacitate each human individual's ability to procreate. So it's sort of like an automatic sterilization button. So by pressing it, you guarantee that humanity will go the way of the dodo within a handful of generations. And it's a guarantee. or you just make them go poof. Whatever is more convenient for the viewer. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of my thought experiment. The point is, to refuse to press such a button may seem on the surface to be conducive to the concerns of sentiocentric antinatalists. Essentially, the sort of antinatalists who extend their procreative booze not just to human species but to all other species. To the extent that a organism has interests, the procreative boo will apply. Right? So you got your human-centric antinatalists like Vehement, and you got your sentiocentric antinatalists. And so I say that, well, on the surface, right, it seems that one ought not to press that button, but that hinges on the assumption that there is a non-zero probability that human action will sooner or later result in the discontinuation of human or non-human procreation and resolve the wild animal suffering problem. And I talk about how this really flies in the face of the whole idea of using probability to determine the moral status of an action, because it's a mindfuck. And it ties into another point I made earlier about this idea that there's a fine line between foreseeable and non-foreseeable outcomes. It's sort of magical thinking. There is no clear dividing line. And the probability that humans will do something to definitely discontinue the problem of wild animal suffering is so minute that you are refusing to definitely solve the human procreation problem, all by banking on a wild card for the non-human problem, just because the non-human problem contains vastly more individual organisms that can be harmed through procreation in the wilderness. So probability extremely small with a much higher payoff. How do you account for that in terms of moral reasoning about the predictable consequences? And you can't. And so it flies in the face of this idea that my dual consequentialism video, like from January 2016, I do these neat divisions between, well, the actual consequence is not what we judge. We judge the agent based on what the agent was planning to do in terms of foreseeable consequences. But of course that assumes that there is such a thing as the foreseeable and the unforeseeable, and that moral reasoning about it will get us there. So it's a sort of rosy view of probability theory. And very few people get probability theory right, and even if you get it right, you're still gambling in a scenario like this. So, yeah, enjoy the post. Oh, surprise, surprise, I got carried away. Massively. What was supposed to be a prelude to the actual video ended up being me talking about the 3 posts for, I think, damn near 30 minutes. And so it's not much of an appetizer if you're going to be filled up on 30 minutes worth of content. So I don't want to overburden people with an additional damn near 30-minute video of its own on top of this. So what I promised to attach to this at the start, I'm just going to have to postpone for a few days and make it its own standalone video. Because yeah, I mean the synopsis for the 3 posts is already just way too much. I should probably split that into 3 videos itself, because I don't just give a synopsis. I overdo it. Lo and behold. Now what the hell did I think was going to happen? I can't do a brief of 3 posts. I can't do a brief of a single post and not go on and on about it. It's just impossible for me, because the moment I introduce a concept, I have to go in depth about the concept. So I can't do an appetizer thing. I have to just give you shovel food down your throats. Conceptual food, let's just say. But I'll try my best in the future when I plug a post to just give you a brief outline, because it's necessary. But in this case, yeah, just 3 separate posts. I don't know if I'm going to split up the introductions to them into separate videos, or if I'll just keep the damn near 30-minute rant as its own thing. But I will definitely not attach the old recording to this, because there's no point to it. So yes, let me know if you would press the yellow button. All of that having been said, I'm very eager to know. And yeah, I think that's it. Stay tuned for more. Bye-bye.